Hello, everyone. Greetings. We're going to begin. My name is Ilham Kapoor, and on behalf of my Global South Forum colleagues, Abidine Kuzno, Viviana Patroni, Anna Zalik, Pablo Idahosa, and Stefan Kipfer, let me extend a very warm welcome to, well, first our wonderful four panelists, one of whom is missing, but hopefully he'll join soon. They'll be introduced shortly. But also to all of you in the audience, thank you all for joining us. This is the second Global South Forum of the year, Reconceptualizing Bandung, Non-Alignment and Third Worldism Today. Very exciting. I want to point out that we are recording this event and it will be posted on the web. Just so that you in the audience are aware, our speakers are already aware and have agreed to recording the event. Before we begin, a few things. I wanted to thank our sponsors and supporters, the York Center for Asian Research, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, Founders College, and the graduate and undergraduate programs in Development Studies and African Studies, all here at York University. It's important as well, I believe, to acknowledge that the York University campus is located on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. But of course, it's never enough just to make this land acknowledgement. It's crucial, I think, that we use this event devoted precisely to the question of non-alignment and third worldism to reflect deeply on undoing the neo-colonial socioeconomic structures that continue to exploit and dispossess peoples and communities today, including on this very land known as Takaranto. And I'm sure our speakers and our discussion today will be doing just that. So the plan is that each of our four panelists will speak for 12 minutes, to be followed then by a discussion and a Q&A, which is the very reason for this forum. It's called a forum for that reason. So we very much look forward to your comments and questions. So without further ado, let's begin. I'm passing the baton over to my colleague Abidine, who will be introducing our first panelist, Lin Lewis, Professor Lin Lewis. So over to you, Abidine. Thanks.
Thank you, Ilan. Now, considering that the past is as important as the present, as well as the future, our first speaker is a social historian. Lin Lewis is Associate Professor in Modern Global History at the University of Bristol. I first knew Lin's work through her book manuscript, which she eventually published in 2016. It is called Cities in Motion, Urban Life and Cosmopolitanism in Southeast Asia, 1920 to 1940. The book, published by Cambridge University Press, won the Urban History Association's prize for Best Book. The book has changed the way we think about colonial cities. With Lin, colonial cities were not only sites of domination, but also grounds for the formations of transnational activism, anti-colonial socialist internationalism, and alternative cosmopolitanism. Since then, Lin has been working on activist lineages in the Afro-Asian world. Today, Lin is going to share with us the little known, what we could call proto-history of Bandung, so that the Bandung moment won't be starting from the time of the diplomats or state leaders, but from civil society movements that were at once local and global. The title of Lin's presentations, therefore, is Transnational Activisms and the Broader Bandung Movement. Thank you. Over to you, Lin.
Thank you so much, Abidine. I really appreciate this invitation. It's an honor to be sharing this platform with this distinguished panel of activists and intellectuals. So as Abidin mentioned, I come to this as a historian interested in the global history of activism in the Global South. And for the past few years, I've been working collaboratively on a research project with other colleagues on Afro-Asian, on the broader Afro-Asian moment. And what generated this feeling was thinking a little bit about the kind of wider interest that was generated in Bandung at the moment around the conference itself and the diplomats, as Abidin mentioned, and particular national leaders and charismatic national figures. I'm just going to share my screen here. But as I mentioned, so we have, we have all of these leaders like Nehru, who was coming onto the stage as a revolutionary hero. We have Nehru, the elder statesman, and Sukarno and Zhou Enlai, the kind of elder brother figure. And our project was really interested in thinking about this beyond the diplomats and looking at how activists and intellectuals, how women, trade union networks, how political parties in opposition to those leaders were engaging in the Afro-Asian project. And what we did was uncover a range of gatherings and conferences. And we started really from conferences itself and looking at the range of conferences in the Afro-Asian era, because they provided a good starting point. A conference in that time was a signaling point about collective vision and solidarity. And I wanted to kind of highlight some of these just on the screen. Just a minute here. What we did is, one thing that we did is we had a visualization about some of these conferences, which kind of really signals the way in which internationalism itself was becoming more located in the Global South, and that third world internationalism was being shaped in particular sites. In Delhi, in Rangoon, in Accra, in Bandung, in Jakarta, in Tashkent, and really these kind of new sites that were, a lot of them on international air routes, because this was a new age of increasingly accessible air travel that had once been the preserve of the colonial elites. So all of this is opening up a new world. So if we begin with the Asian Relations Conference, this was a conference that was, in some sense, Nehru was the kind of a leading figure of the conference, but so was a woman named Sarojini Naidu, who was the poet, female social activist, who was the president of the Asian Relations Conference, and presided over the conference and talked about, and this was really an occasion to think about Asia as a venue for a new kind of regionalism, a new kind of internationalism, and thinking about laying the foundations for non-alignment, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism. And as my colleague Caroline Stolte, who was leading the Afro-Asian Networks project with, as she's argued, this was really the culmination of interwar Asianism, the Asianism of trade unions, of women's movements, of activists that were really thinking about Asia on a broader level and forming those networks and connections already. It was really about a belief in a kind of world community beyond, rather than that of state-centered internationalism that tended to be characterized in Bandung. But it was, of course, not without its tensions. Asianism was seen as a threat by Southeast Asians who had just been under the Japanese occupation. But nonetheless, it really started to lay the foundations for a new kind of Asian community. Moving from Delhi, we were looking at the Asian Women's Conference in Beijing in China, and Beijing is a new kind of hub for a lot of these really new international connections to take place, and particularly around anti-racist politics. And here with the WIDF, this is really about advocating for women's rights and against militarism. So the Asian Women's Conference in 1949, as well as the next conference that takes place, the Asia Pacific Peace Conference in 1952. And you see, sorry, I should have explained, all these lines are where people are coming from to travel to these conferences. And it's quite extraordinary to think about the Chilean delegation. If we just click on this line here, and you see all of these particular figures who are members of Chilean peace movements traveling all the way to Beijing in 1952. People from New Zealand, people from Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. So this is a conference that is really bringing together and extending the cartography of third world internationalism in this period. So you can also go to this website. It's on the Afro-Asian, the link is on the Afro-Asian Networks website. And so this, obviously, thinking about Beijing as a new kind of hub of internationalism. Another one that I've looked at quite a bit is the Asian Socialist Conference in Rangoon in 1953, which was really a gathering of Asian kind of democratic socialists that were interested in carving out, again, this kind of non-aligned path beyond what they saw as Soviet totalitarianism and exploitative colonial capitalism and Western neocolonialism. And really that conference was about also laying the foundations for the welfare state, about thinking about the promise of kind of equal rights and individual rights for women, freedom of association, freedom of the press. And then of course we have the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung. We have the Afro-Asian Students Conference, which is incomplete yet, but will be soon. And then we have the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in Cairo, which is starting to lean more left. There is a Soviet presence, there is a Soviet patronage at that conference, but it's also tied up, as with Beijing, with this broader world peace movement that's anti-nuclear proliferation, anti-biological weapons, very much concerned with peace, but also this is an age like right after the Suez crisis, when Nasser is emerging on the revolutionary stage as a leader and really trying to style himself as a kind of new leader for the Afro-Asian world. Following that, 4 years later, we have the Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent that brings together a range of writers from across Africa and Asia. And there's this wonderful quotation from Ngugi wa Thiong'o that talks about, the way in which we found these links that bound us. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that conference led on to new kinds of connections among writers, including the publication Lotus, the kind of magazine of Afro-Asian writings that became that was based in Cairo and became a real rallying point from the late 1960s to the 1970s for writers all over the world. In the global South. We have the ACRA, the All African Peoples Conference, which is kind of a movement away from Afro-Asianism and thinking more about Pan-Africanism. And then again, movements where APSO continues in Conakry and Guinea, the Afro-Asian Women's Conference, and of course the Tricontinental, which is a little bit out of the map, but meets in Havana and really kind of extends the cartography of Afro-Asian to include Latin America and creates a new kind of tricontinental imagination for the global South. So just to come back to the PowerPoint, so I mentioned all of these various conferences. This was a wonderful mural in Beijing, designed by Diego Rivera that dominated the conference hall. We have the Asian Socialist Conference that had a number of political opposition leaders and political parties. And again, as I mentioned, laid the foundation as well, not only the welfare state, but ideas about Afro-Asian solidarity. We had freedom parties from Uganda, from Kenya, from Tunisia, speaking at that conference and talking about the need to kind of push independence campaigns in Africa and create those new kinds of connections. And from that, the Anti-Colonial Bureau, it produced a number of publications, including Socialist Asia, which is a publication for socialist parties all over Asia, as well as the Anti-Colonial Bureau newsletter, which covered anti-colonial movements all over the African continent, as well as in Malaya, and was actually edited. But so Rangoon, the Asian Socialist Conference, was not only an event in 1953, but an organization based in Rangoon for a number of years. And the editor of the Anti-Colonial Bureau newsletter was actually from Ghana. He was a man named James Markham, who ended up and edited that newsletter out of Rangoon for a year before becoming one of the 3 Ghanaian delegates at the Bandung conference 2 years later in Bandung. So there's a really interesting connections between all these networks and activists and all these earlier conferences and gatherings. I mentioned Cairo, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference, and the role of the Soviet presence, and the increasing visibility of women at that conference. Another famous Indian female activist, Rameshwari Nehru, was president of that conference and spoke at its opening session. And then that kind of laid the foundations for the Afro-Asian Women's Conference that came later. And as I mentioned in this note here, APSO continues to exist today as an organization devoted to peaceful negotiation between states and carrying out the principles of Bandung and the non-aligned movement. I mentioned Havana, the Tricontinental Conference, which was, again, a kind of involving the second generation of third world leaders in Latin America that had this impression of being more militant and revolutionary than that first generation, committed to strategies of national liberation and aligned to anti-imperialism and this wider challenge of capitalism. There were Indonesian participants to that conference as well, especially part of the Indonesian left. Francisca Fangadaj, who was an Indonesian leftist, actually had her passport annulled during that conference in the aftermath of the 1965 coup in Indonesia, and actually ended up having to go into exile in China. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I think I'm almost at 12 minutes, but I'll try to speed up here. I mentioned a number of publications that emerge out of these connections in the global South, and including the ones out of Rangoon with Socialist Asia. The Afro-Asian Journalists was established in Jakarta and then moved to Beijing in 1965. And I also mentioned Lotus, which was the Afro-Asian Writers Association publication, which was a tri-quarterly based in Cairo until the late 1970s. And it's a beautiful magazine if you have any chance to look at it. It's got art, it has poetry from Chinese poets talking about African drums and Vietnamese poetry from that period and solidarity with Palestine. It's an incredible journal, and a lot of people have been starting to write more about it and give it its due recognition. I wanted to end a little bit on civil society legacies, and I know that Yao is going to be speaking from Third World Network, which I always mention because it was established in Penang, which I've studied a lot, and seems to me a real kind of inheritor of some of these lineages of development and of South-South cooperation. But again, I'm sure Yao could speak more about the inheritances of Bandung in civil society, and so could the other people on this panel. But I just wanted to highlight some of the ways in which this Bandung era continues to have resonance today for a number of civil society activists. I think in the 1980s, a lot of those connections started in 1990s, a lot of those connections started to be rediscovered. But from what I know from the activists that I've spoken to, at that time, there wasn't a lot of, in some cases, there wasn't a lot of understanding about that broader history of that activism and all these gatherings and conferences and networks that had happened in the 50s and 60s. So I think part of what we're trying to do is really recover that period. But I'm also really looking forward to hearing more about how those lineages have continued and transformed in the realm of civil society. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Surin. This is wonderful. So let me now turn this forum over to my colleague, Anna Zalik, to introduce the next speaker, Yao Graham. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Abidin, also for all your work organizing this panel. So we're thrilled that Dr. Yao Graham, the coordinator of Third World Network, is here with us today. As Sulen just referenced, Third World Network is part of a broader global movement and is a Pan-Africa research and advocacy organization based in Accra, Ghana, that is one of the continent's leading policy and campaigning organizations on economic justice and the environment, critiquing national and international policies. TWN Africa's work covers economic policy, international trade, and investment. Dr. Graham is an internationally renowned scholar activist who has written extensively on African global development issues since the 1970s, working with key social organizations, including trade unions. He has served on the coordinating committee of Social Watch and is Africa editor for the Review of African Political Economy, and holds a doctorate degree from the University of Warwick. So many thanks, Yao, for being with us today. And over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna and colleagues, for this opportunity to be part of this webinar. Sulen, I wish I could speak a bit more about the TWN and its lineage. I'll come to that a bit near the end of my thing. But just as a prefatory thing, I was in a meeting in South Africa last week, and someone came up to me and said, "What is this Third World Network? This is outdated. You know, we are not third world in terms of anybody's hierarchies." This is a leading archbishop activist, you know, in South Africa, you know. So during a break, I explained to him the history of the term and that it is not a kind of, as it were, a hierarchy of status. But people in Africa are very sensitive about that term because they think it shows that people in the third world have a certain inferior grade compared to the first and second world. But once I explained its lineage, I said, oh, okay, now I'm better educated on it. But what that point shows us that the kind of the way in which knowledge and connection with that history, you know, is receding in many spaces among activists who ought to know better. My thing focuses really on a kind of a more contemporary challenge. Basically, what possibilities exist for global South solidarity in addressing Africa's development challenges in the context, of course, the changes that we know have been taking place globally, and also the changes taking place in the character of key actors in the non-aligned movement, and not only in the context in which they are operating. I think the first one I'd like to make is that in talking about Bandung, the non-aligned movement, third worldism and reconceptualization, the foundation of the Bandung tradition, so to speak, in popular anti-colonial struggles, I think is very important. I mean, that popular anti-colonial struggle, of course, is a point of unity. And that point of unity underlines also the fact that what united, and I think continues to unite countries in the NAM in key areas, has to do with not how they position themselves vis-a-vis power blocks in the world, but what they had in common, what they aspired to, and what they were fighting against. Basically, a shared history of colonial domination, an ambition to escape that, an ambition to be able to reconstruct their economies away from the colonial legacies in the African context, which remains today, which was common in the past, of raw material commodity export dependence, and of course, a subordinate location in the international division of labor and having relatively little influence, you know, on global governance. And I think those things remain important despite the shifts which have taken place in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also the rise of China, which has become the focal point of a kind of new Cold War vis-a-vis the West. Because one of the constants throughout this history is the fact that, I mean, it's and as the Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia arising from the Ukraine war has shown us, is that, I mean, the US and its allies dominate the world. And that domination remains a defining context for any development project, you know, in places like Africa. And we've seen that in the attack on Iraq. We've seen that in the destruction of Libya. We've seen that in the isolation of Iran. We've seen that in the illegal attack on Serbia. We've seen that in the blockade of Cuba, which has been going on, you know, for 6 decades. I mean, this reality continues to define the context within which countries of the global south are trying, to transform their reality. Now, the issue of Bandung, Nam, and so on, itself, I think it's important to note the ways in which that evolution is playing out. Because China, of course, was an important presence in Bandung, but China is not a member of the non-aligned movement, although has sought to associate itself with the expression of the non-aligned movement, international fora, the G77 and China. And I think those are important differentiations which have consequences in terms of how the politics of the non-aligned movement and particularly in the African context, it's playing out. In Bandung, African countries were present primarily as observers because most of them were still under colonial rule. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah was there as the leader of a 3-member Ghanaian delegation, but at that time, he was leader of government business in the colonial administration. By the founding of NAM in Belgrade, because most African countries were independent, and NASA and Nkrumah were key players on the African side in the construction of the non-aligned movement, which gave organizational expression at the interstate level to the project, that was initiated by the Bandung conference. And I think a number of things which have happened, which cemented the relationship, I think remains of relevance, whatever may be going on, and particularly relevant for Africa. Because, for example, the unities that NAM countries found in the creation of the G77 and China at the first UNCTAD conference in 1964 was very important. Because UNCTAD, as you know, was created to work on the restructuring of the global economy, particularly the problems of the subordinate place of developing countries in international division of labor, and also the key question of the commodity dependence, which of course remains an important problem for African countries. So a body like UNCTAD, where Latin American economies rubbish was a very key influence, itself began to show the connection from Asia to Africa to Latin America in terms of the Latin American experience of post-war development being brought to bear on the global south situation. And I think from that to a call for a new international economic order, which from an African perspective basically represented a challenge to the global dominance of the imperial powers and their allies, was very key. And that remains a concern for African countries. And if you look at that early period, you find the character of support for the African transformation agenda quite explicit in terms of having more the quality of solidarity than compared to some of the things that we observe now. You take, for example, the extensive support that key NAM countries gave to the national liberation movement in Africa, not only in the international arena, but also through material support. A lot of the guerrilla movements from Africa had training camps in China, in Algeria, in Cuba. Cuba provided a lot of support in the latter stages of the armed struggle in Southern Africa. Those represented a certain tradition of solidarity, where countries took risks in terms of a challenge to imperialism. So if you connect back to my earlier point, really, I mean, if you define the common problem that face ex-colonial people, the dominance of imperialism, which may have been overthrown politically at the national level, but which remained globally defining, was a common problem. So that strategic unity, I think, underlined the kind of support that was forthcoming. You look even in terms of the post-colonial development approaches. I mean, Yugoslavia gave a lot of support to newly independent African countries. So did China, in terms of trying to offer them perspective and new ways of development. And also the classic case of the Tazara Railway that China provided, linking Zambia and Tanzania, as a gift to those people. Now, for the African context, the legacy of raw material commodity export dependence remains an important contemporary issue and a development challenge. Whilst in Asia, you can talk about quite some advance in terms of economic transformation and a kind of social upliftment. Africa, of course, remains the poorest continent and the one still caught up, in the mechanisms of raw material dependence. So, in that sense, in this moment, the challenge of economic transformation is very central to the African agenda. But this is also the moment in which we can see also the differentiation which is taking place within the now. It's expressing itself in the form of contradictions in the African context. I mean, China, as I said, was never part of the non-aligned movement, but part of the G77 in China in terms of its expression in the international fora. China, of course, is the most significant global South economic power, seen by the US as a strategic rival. And that is expressed in terms of China's own positioning in places like Africa, and also, in a certain sense, the logic of Chinese capital accumulation itself has begun to manifest itself in terms of a presence and practice which really is consistent with the logic of capital. And the logic of capital basically is reflected in a competition for sources of raw material on the same terms as the former colonial powers. There's the search for markets with implications for African, industrialization, the look for kind of outlets for lending and so on. I mean, whilst this represents a multipolarity, which creates opportunities for Africa, we also need to highlight the fact that there's a dimension which is quite different if you compare it to the early period of the non-aligned movement and the cooperative solidarity, framework with which countries operated. Because if you look at the global governance level, again, you find that in the Bretton Woods reform, the Bretton Woods institution, for example, which all global South countries are agreed on, the position of China, which is interested in being an influential player because of its economic size, reserves, and its weight in international trade, is quite different from that of African countries who are particularly interested in the reform of conditionalities, in lending terms, because they remain countries, that borrow. India-China competition in Africa is a dimension again of the way in which these shifts, have expressed themselves. So the old type solidarity that one was a feature of the NAM has been replaced by the fact that these better resource countries, whilst they offer the multipolarity that they represent, whilst it represents an opportunities to pivot away from the historic colonial powers, provides only a little bit more play compared to what those powers used to give. But having said that, I think important points of convergence and affinity and common interest remain because the countries, the NAM member countries, retain a common interest in the reform of the global governance regime. Of course, on one hand, the bigger ones like India and China and South Africa are quite comfortable being part of the G20, which is another point of kind of undermining of the United Nations multilateralism. But at the same time, together with the other NAM members, they are interested, in reform of the global kind of political and economic architecture. The issues of non-interference, sovereignty, and being able to choose your own development path remain important points, of common interest. And I think we have a contradictory situation in terms of the possibilities of global South solidarity and engagement with the tackling Africa's development challenges. In addition, we also have a situation where I think it's important to note that this is not simply a problem which is emanating from changes in the NAM member countries, but in Africa itself, the issues of the evolution of regimes, class transitions, and alliances that they built, with the major powers has become a factor in weakening the prospects of NAM relations. I mean, interference by Western powers in Africa runs parallel with the fact that many African regimes today are much more comfortable, with being allies or in the pocket of the ex-colonial powers and kind of taking the risk of strategic relationships, with partner countries, in the South. And I think this brings me to my last point, which is that it goes back to Sulin's point about the popular dimension of Bandung and non-alignment, because as I said at the beginning, the popular struggles were the basis of the regime types that emerged after colonialism and who then were actors, in Bandung and in the creation of the non-aligned movement. And I think that popular dimension remains important. I mean, if I look, for example, at my own involvement historically over time, I was very active in the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization in the 1980s, and I met a lot of activists from the Global South. I've been involved also with the work that we do in Third World Network in our international campaigning. If you look at the global agenda, the alternative globalization movement that we're part of, the struggle against structural adjustment programs, the struggle against neoliberalism, the struggles around climate change, and so on. These have had critical presence of Global South organizations, which have been at the core of a North-South alliances in various arenas. In 2003 in Cancun, when the World Trade Organization talks collapsed, it is arguable that it took the pressure from Southern civil society organizations present to push the governments to take the positions that they did. The current status in the WTO dates from that period. And that was an important moment of confluence of state society engagement around Global South issues. So in terms of the future, it is important for us to remember this two tracks which are intertwined in terms of ensuring political effectiveness. And from an African perspective, this remains important for being able to rediscover the best traditions of Bandung and the non-aligned movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yao, for an excellent talk. Much appreciated. And now I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Stefan Kipper, who will introduce Houria Bouteldja.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's my pleasure to introduce Houria Bouteldja, who comes to us today from Paris. Houria is a founding member of Le Parti des Indigènes de la République, a decolonial political member organization based in France. She has written numerous theoretical strategic articles on decolonial feminism, racism, autonomy, and political alliances, as well as articles on Zionism and state philo-Semitism. She is the author with Cédric Chiari of Nous sommes les indigènes de la République, which was published by Édition Amsterdam, and also the monograph, Whites, Jews, and Us, Towards a Politics of Revolutionary Love, which appeared in translation with semiotext. Houria Bouteldja recently resigned from the party, but she is still a decolonial activist. So without further ado, here is Houria. I will be translating in intervals as we go along.
Do you hear me? Oui. Donc bonjour tout le monde et merci, merci pour cette invitation. Merci Stéphane pour cette introduction et merci de me traduire.
Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the translation to come.
Donc effectivement, je suis une militante décoloniale et je fais partie du mouvement décolonial français qui existe depuis 2005.
So I'm indeed an activist within the decolonial movement in France, which exists since 2005.
Je fais également partie du réseau décolonial international qui s'appelle le DIN, Decolonial International Network.
And I'm also part of the international network called the Decolonial International Network.
Et au sein du DIN, nous avons décidé en 2018, puisque c'est le sujet de cette conversation, nous avons décidé d'organiser le Bandung du Nord.
In 2018, the DIN, the Decolonial International Network, decided to organize a conference in Paris called the Bandung of the North.
Donc, c'est un espèce de forum qui a duré 3 jours et qui a rassemblé ce que nous appelons des sujets postcoloniaux habitant dans le Nord, c'est-à-dire les racisés.
This was a 3-day conference that reunited a number of speakers and participants that we call post-colonial subjects, racialized inhabitants of the global North.
Alors, l'esprit du Bandung du Nord, puisqu'effectivement, il tire sa filiation du Bandung de 1955, c'est d'abord la question de l'héritage anticolonial.
The starting question raised in this conference, which did situate itself in that lineage going back to 1955, the Bandung Conference, was to reflect indeed on the legacy of that tradition.
Alors, l'héritage anticolonial, mais dans une situation nouvelle, puisque nous ne sommes pas les damnés de la terre de Frantz Fanon, nous ne sommes plus les damnés de la terre de Frantz Fanon, nous sommes des sujets postcoloniaux vivant en Europe, et qu'à ce titre, nous sommes ce que nous appelons des indigènes de la République, c'est-à-dire des sujets racialisés qui tirent profit malgré tout, malgré le racisme, des rapports Nord-Sud.
So even though this conference was framed in that longer legacy of anti-colonial politics, we found ourselves in a new situation because as inhabitants of the imperial North, we can no longer see ourselves to be the wretched of the earth, to speak with Frantz Fanon. As racialized people in the global North, we also profit from imperialism, despite the realities of racism.
Donc, nous sommes une nouvelle réalité sociale. Donc, de par le nombre, nous sommes une nouvelle réalité sociale. L'idée du Bandung du Nord et du mouvement décolonial, c'est de faire de nous une nouvelle réalité politique, c'est-à-dire de faire de nous des sujets politiques dans le Nord.
In this new social reality, the main point of the conference was to reflect and promote the process whereby the indigenous of France and the racialized people in the North could become a new political subject.
Sauf qu'il faut définir ce nouveau sujet politique, comme je l'ai dit, avec une conscience forte que nous ne sommes plus des damnés de la Terre, mais également en tirant les bilans des luttes des gauches européennes dans leur rapport au Sud.
Part of this process of developing new political subjects was also the important reflection on the history of the left in the North and its relationship to the global South.
L'important pour nous et l'urgence pour nous, en tant que venant du Sud, en tant qu'anti-impérialiste, l'important pour nous était de mettre fin à ce que Aimé Césaire appelait le fraternalisme ou le paternalisme, c'est-à-dire cette tendance qu'a la gauche blanche à donner des leçons de libération et d'émancipation pour les peuples du Sud.
And one of the chief tasks that we set ourselves is to raise the importance of doing away with what Aimé Césaire called in the 1950s fraternalism and paternalism. So this habit of the white left in the North to teach lessons to the world about liberation and revolution.
Et donc, à ce titre, notre point de départ était le suivant. le Sud libère le Sud et le Nord libère le Nord.
The basic premise upon which we operated was to say that the South liberates the South and the North liberates the North.
Comme nous vivons dans le centre impérialiste, la priorité pour nous n'est pas de donner des leçons de libération pour le Sud, mais de combattre notre propre impérialisme.
The main task for us, the indigenous of France and racialized people in the North, was not to give lessons about anti-imperialism to the South, but to engage in a struggle against imperialism, our own imperialisms in the North.
Mais nous avons également cette idée forte qui considère que les luttes des pays du Sud nous libèrent, nous, de notre propre impérialisme.
And part of that discussion was the reflection on the role of liberation movements in the South in working towards liberating us in the North.
À ce titre, on envisage les luttes du Nord et les luttes du Sud comme deux temps de la Révolution mondiale, en fait.
In this view, struggles in the North and struggles in the South, anti-imperial struggles in the North and anti-imperial struggles in the South represent two temporalities and two modalities for global liberation.
Pour autant, ça ne suffit pas à expliquer le rapport avec le Bandung.
This, however, what I've said so far is not yet enough to explain the relationship between the Bandung of the North and the actual Bandung Conference in 1955.
Alors, on l'a appelé le Bandung du Nord parce que pour nous, l'idée forte, l'idée importante, c'était la question des alliances transnationales.
A key question in this slide was to reflect on the nature of global transnational alliances.
Aujourd'hui, il y a des Suds à l'intérieur du Nord.
And key in this reflection was to recognize the presence of various southern, in quotation marks, spaces in the global North.
Parce qu'il y a des Suds à l'intérieur du Nord, l'idée du Bandung était de créer les conditions pour une alliance des sujets postcoloniaux à l'intérieur du Nord global.
So a key task was to develop a strategy to build alliances among the spaces of the global South in the North itself.
C'est la raison pour laquelle, dans cette conférence du Bandung du Nord, il y avait des Maghrébins vivant en France, des Africains vivant en France, des Antillais, mais également des Asiatiques, des Chinois qui vivent en Angleterre, des Roms et des Gitans vivant en Espagne, des Hindous et des Pakistanais vivant en Angleterre, ou d'autres populations venues du Sud qui vivent en Hollande, au Portugal, etc., etc.
So the conference reunited a whole series of inhabitants of the North. So, for example, North Africans living in France, Sub-Saharan Africans living in France, and people from the French Antilles living in metropolitan France. People from China and East Asia living in the UK, people from South Asia, Pakistan and India living in the UK, Roma peoples living in Spain, and other peoples like that from other parts of Europe, like Portugal and the Netherlands.
Donc l'idée, comme vous le voyez, c'était de construire une nouvelle conscience politique décoloniale, dont le but est d'organiser les populations du Sud dans un programme à la fois antiraciste et anti-impérialiste, et en même temps d'avoir comme axe stratégique de combattre avant tout notre impérialisme.
So the point was to develop, work towards a common political consciousness, connecting anti-racism and anti-imperialism, and connecting various southern spaces in the North in that project of building an anti-imperialism within the North itself.
Et ça s'est exprimé, en tout cas, ça s'est matérialisé par la mise en avant des revendications du type « il faut lutter contre le racisme d'État, il faut lutter contre la police raciste, il faut lutter contre les violences policières, il faut lutter contre l'islamophobie, contre la négrophobie, contre la romophobie, il faut lutter contre le système carcéral qui emprisonne avant tout des sujets racialisés, mais toujours avec cette articulation qui pour nous est impérative avec la lutte anticoloniale et anti-impérialiste.
So the discussion generated a whole series of demands and imperatives, anti-racist imperatives, the struggle against state racism, the struggle against police violence in particular, the struggle against Islamophobia, against Negrophobia, against Romaphobia. All these demands we try to articulate and connect to anti-imperialism and the global decolonial project.
Alors, je voudrais juste finir en spécifiant, en expliquant la raison pour laquelle l'articulation avec l'anti-impérialisme est fondamentale pour nous.
I will just now explain why this articulation of anti-racist demands on the one hand and anti-imperialism is so fundamental for us.
Alors, c'est le caractère fondamental de la lutte anti-impérialiste, elle est située par rapport au fait que si on se contentait de lutte antiraciste contre l'État raciste, les violences policières ou par exemple l'islamophobie, eh bien nous ne serions qu'un mouvement intégrationniste. C'est-à-dire, nous ne ferions que demander, qu'exiger une place à l'intérieur d'un État impérialiste qui continue de profiter du rapport de domination nord-sud. Mais si nous articulons avec l'anti-impérialisme, ça signifie que nous refusons notre propre intégration à l'intérieur du système impérialiste et raciste, c'est-à-dire à l'intérieur des États-nations impérialistes.
So the thinking is as follows. If we were to restrict ourselves to anti-racist struggles of various kinds against Islamophobia, against police racism, and so on, we would be restricting ourselves to making demands to integrate and fight for our place within an otherwise still imperialist and racist system. If, however, we articulate anti-racist demands to anti-imperialist demands, then we can develop our anti-racist demands also by way of refusing that integration into the imperialist system.
Alors, pour le dire autrement, nous refusons, à partir d'une conscience qui vient de notre histoire coloniale et à partir d'une conscience anti-intégrationniste, pour le dire en un seul mot, nous refusons de devenir des Blancs.
We can put this to a simple formula, which is to say that we refuse to become white.
Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Merci bien, Houria.
Merci à toi, Stéphane.
So I'm going to hand over the mic to Pablo, although I guess Walden is not here. Pablo, do you have any?
Yes, regrettably, I've been trying to contact Walden, but regrettably, I haven't been able to get hold of him. But nonetheless, I'd like to say a few words about Walden Bello, because I think in many ways, while his absence is regrettable, I think in other ways who he is, what he stood for and what he stands for and what he's currently standing for is in some senses essential to this discussion. As many of you know, Walden Bello is a long-time scholar activist who taught at SUNY Binghamton for a number of years, but who in particular was active in a number of international and Global South Forum. And for those who don't know, he's actually currently running for vice president under Labangan Massa, which broadly translates apparently as Fight for the Masses, a coalition of left-wing and socialist groups fighting against the HMP, the Alliance for Change. And he's also currently under some duress, in fact, because Duterte's daughter accused him of supporting drug addicts, essentially. First of all, I think this is important that he's in a sense putting his academic life on hold to do what he's always done in his life, which is to be an activist. I'm just going to quickly run through some of his publications that give you an idea, I think, of some of his academic and intellectual, but also policy-orientated activist interventions. With Joseph Gerson, he's written Empire and the Bomb. He's written Deglobalization, Ideas for a New World Economy, Dark Victory, the United States and Global Poverty. Famously, his work on food wars, his work with Susan George and David Ransman on People First Economics, Making Clean Start for Jobs, Justice and Climate Change. In addition, most recently, Why Financial Crashes Happen and Why China Will Be Next. He's also published a book with, Elaine Illenson called The Development Debacle, the World Bank in the Philippines. But I would be remiss if I didn't also, of course, mention, in addition to him running for vice president, that, of course, he's been a human rights advocate. He's served in many positions in a number of policy think tanks and non-governmental organizations at all levels, so national, regional, and international. Executive Director of Food First, co-founder and co-chair of the board of Focus on the Global South. He's been president of Freedom from Debt Coalition, member and former chair of the board of Greenpeace in Southeast Asia, and a member of the International Forum on Globalization, the Transnational Institute and the Nautilus Institute, as well as the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. It's a terrible shame that he's not here, but given that I suspect the logistics of the moment probably compel him or to reserve him for the currency of what he's currently involved in. But nonetheless, I think it's an important segue from Houria's intervention concerning the global South in the global North and the intersection of these kinds of struggles, thinking about these issues historically through the different, we might, if we don't want to call it that, the possible conception of hierarchies within the global South. And one of the large elephants in the room, of course, which is that of China, which regrettably, him not being here, I know that Walden would have spoken to. But I think this is probably the moment to open up the discussion and to bring many of these not so disparate components together to help us understand Bandung in the present as this lineage from the past. So I'll pass it over to Viviana to open up the discussion from here. So thanks once again for everyone's participation thus far. And we can only hope that perhaps Walden might join us along the way, keeping our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pablo, very much for that. We'd just like to thank the panelists for their most insightful interventions, and there are a number of questions, and I would say this is the kind of very enriching and engaging conversations that we like to think the Global South Forum is precisely the place for. So thank you again for that.